Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie Howell. I'm from the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, Science and Ethics Agree, Coexistence Must Replace Killing Wolves. When it comes to managing wolves, government wildlife agencies have shown little inclination to independently support gray wolf recovery at viable or ecological effective levels. Instead, history has demonstrated that unless wolves are afforded legal protections, legal and liberal wolf control and state-sanctioned wolf hunting have often become the predominant management strategy. Failing to consider biology and the intrinsic value of wolves, government management policies remain rooted in the belief that wolves are an animal in need of management and that wolves should be treated as a problem. Considering the overwhelming scientific evidence of wolf sentience, wolf self-awareness and culture, as well as our ability to coexist, should killing wolves be the go-to management tool? With us tonight, Francisco J. Santiago-Ávila will talk to us about the need for ethically based scientific oversight of wolf populations. He'll discuss the scientific and ethical case for protecting wolves and how we can begin to transition from traditional conservation to worldviews grounded in care, respect, and coexistence. Fran is a graduate of the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, where he got his BA in political science and economics. He earned his master's of public policy and environmental management at Duke University and his PhD in environment and resources at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Fran is the Big River Connectivity Science and Conservation Manager for Project Coyote and the Rewilding Institute, where he promotes the claims and protection of wild carnivores against killing and harm. And he's also the founding member of PAN Works. Prior to that, Fran was an associate lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the postdoctoral research associate at the Carnivore Coexistence Lab. Lastly, we're really excited to have him as our guest tonight to discuss this important topic. As a bit of housekeeping before we get started, if you have any questions during Fran's presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll provide time for questions at the end of tonight's presentation. Also, a recorded version of the webinar will be available soon on the Wolf Conservation Center website. So it's time to get started. So now I'm going to turn the time over to you, Fran. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, for the wonderful intro. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for sharing part of your evening with us. I'm very excited to be here presenting on our PanWorks team's latest essays on how to promote appropriate wolf-human relationships grounded in sound ethics and science. So throughout my presentation, I'm going to touch on both the science and ethics of wolf-human interactions, but I'm going to highlight why and how an ethical dialogue, more so than a scientific one, is indispensable for promoting caring, respectful relationships with wolves. So the main argument being that by foregrounding the ethical dialogue and its wider implications for our relationships with animals and the non-human world, we can land on better policy decisions that further the well-being of our entire community of life. So let's get started, right? And I want to begin by briefly setting the stage for of gray wolf Euro-North American relationships in the US. So gray wolves historically ranged throughout most of North America, but the campaign of wolf and largely large predator extermination by European and later Euro-North American colonizers started as soon as Europeans arrived. Now, why did that happen? Well, culturally, first, there were widespread European worldviews that devalued non-human beings, and sometimes wolves in particular, as malicious and even demonic sometimes. And then you have on the economic side, wolves were regarded as pests that harmed domestic animals and then were blamed for reducing wild ungulate numbers as well. So that led to the eradication of almost all wolves from the lower 48 by around the 1930s. Then what happens then? Well, around from the 1930s up to the 1960s, science starts beginning to uncover the ecological role of wolves and top predators generally, which argues for the protection of their populations. And this is achieved with their listing under the Endangered Species Act in the 70s. Now, those protections, along with reintroduction efforts, were successful to an extent in establishing wolf populations that were slowly able to recolonize a minimal portion, around 15% of their historical range, like you see on the map on your left. And this was mainly in the Northern Rockies and the Western Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest. But then, as you see on the graph on your right, around the early 2000s, we start seeing the beginning of a series of relentless attempts by the US Fish and Wildlife Service to delist gray wolves, both regionally and nationally. And then we also have, right, this infamous budget rider that delisted the Northern Rocky Mountains wolves. So where are we right now with wolf protection? So what do we have today? Today, despite this recent February court decision, federal court decision that relisted many wolves, namely those outside the Northern Rockies, gray wolves in the Northern Rockies continue to be exposed to the same indiscriminate state-sponsored killing policies that nearly exterminated them from the contiguous US in the last century. A few examples here, right, that I'd like to mention. Idaho, for example, plans to reduce its wolf population by 90%, with the state hiring contractors to kill wolves and the use of night vision goggles. It's allowed ATVs, leg hold snares, and even shooting from helicopters. And wolf pups in dens are also fair game. In Montana, the plan is to kill up to 85% of wolves. And hunters can kill an unlimited number of wolves day or night. They can use bait, and they can be paid a bounty by the state. And if it wasn't for state and federal courts, Wisconsin would have held 2 wolf hunts in the same year, practically decimating their wolf population, according to independent academics. So these policies, basically, that I've mentioned are crafted, enforced by state wildlife agencies, by natural resource boards and lawmakers, which are largely influenced by hunter and rancher lobbies. Now, we recognize that hunters, rangers, wildlife managers are important constituencies to take into account in wolf policy decisions. Our argument is with their claims, of which we have 5 against strict protections for wolves that we identify. Now, what are these claims? The first one is that the wolf populations are just out of control, that they need killing to be regulated. The second one is that wolves are harming wild ungulate populations, placing them in peril. Third one is that you need to kill wolves to mitigate predation on domestic animals. Fourth one is that managers need to allow wolf killing because that will increase tolerance for the species. It'll also reduce illegal killings of wolves and conflicts, allegedly, and garner political support for wolf conservation from these groups that want to kill wolves. And the fifth one is that the populations of this wolf resource are healthy enough to allow for recreational killing. Now, of course, these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. Hunters and ranchers wield considerable influence in sometimes very undemocratic state wildlife commissions. They will influence in state legislatures and on agency policy as well. And while they are making these policy preferences heard at the policy roundtable, other voices with less influence and power have been rendered practically silent. Now, a big problem here is that others have just as much or more at stake in this conversation and its outcomes, starting with those who have the most at stake here, which are the wolves themselves. Also, indigenous peoples, wildlife and environmental advocates, academicians and scientists, and the broad public are all deeply invested in the fate of wolves. So first, I'm going to argue that the claims made by these hunters, rangers, and wildlife managers who currently control wolf policies are neither scientifically supported nor ethically justified. And I'm going to start with the science. So let's briefly touch on what this latest science says about these 5 claims, right? First one is that wolf populations are out of control. Now, we know that as an apex predator, wolves largely self-regulate their populations. And that internal regulation depends on factors like available resources, and in great part on the social stability of wolf families and the wider community of wolf families that surround each wolf. Wolves don't require any type of lethal management to achieve natural densities. They are not going to run out of control. So what about the second claim? The second claim is that wolves are imperiling wild ungulate populations. Now, again, as apex predators, wolves do exert a regulating influence on wild ungulate populations through predation as well as indirect effects, such as risk assessment by prey. But after 40 years of recovery efforts, there is simply no evidence to suggest that increasing wolf populations are imperiling wild ungulate populations. And in fact, predator removal has been shown to have negligible effects on wild prey populations. So, in addition to that, along with this, there is substantial evidence supporting that wolves have positive ecosystem effects by this regulation of wild ungulates as they expand their distribution. And in fact, through that same expansion, they may even be mitigating harm and economic loss to humans by keeping wild ungulates away from roads and therefore mitigating collisions. So that's even better. Now, what about the third claim? The third claim is that wolf predation, you need to kill wolves to mitigate predation on domestic ungulates. Now, predation on domestic ungulates by wolves accounts for less than 1% of domesticated ungulate deaths, which is much lower than any non-predator cause of death, including disease, including weather, or even calving problems. But still, some ranchers claim that they suffer from chronic conflicts with wolves that require some killing or killing all the wolves in the vicinity. Now, the problem with lethal intervention is that while wolf killing may benefit from this perception of effectiveness in the minds of producers, the evidence for the actual effectiveness of lethal methods is mixed at best. And lethal methods may in fact increase conflicts in the short and long run. For example, in Wisconsin, restricted targeted wolf killing by government agents, I'm not talking here about hunts, resulted in an increasing rate of conflicts, and therefore you get more domestic animals dead and you get more wolves dead over time relative to periods of full protections. We also saw this in our research in Michigan, where we found that lethal methods increase the overall risk of conflicts for groups of farms relative to non-lethal methods. Now, there are two suggested interdependent reasons for this effect that we're seeing. One is that lowering protections for wolves may in fact increase negative attitudes towards wolves. And that negative attitude is going to increase complaints, is going to increase conflicts. The second reason is that killing wolves disrupts their social cohesion and breaks up their family units, their packs. And this complicates their cooperative structure, their cooperative hunting, their cooperative pup rearing, territory defense. And this is going to incentivize wolves to select easier domesticated prey, despite also being scientifically evidenced that wolves prefer wild prey species to domestic ungulates. Now, what about tolerance killing? There's robust evidence mounting that suggests that reducing protections for wolves does not increase tolerance for wolves. On the contrary, reducing protections for wolves is mostly associated with more intolerant attitudes, more intolerant behaviors towards wolves by hunters and ranchers, and substantial increases in wolf poaching. And arguably, reducing protections for wolves, even marginally, may send a policy signal that devalues wolves in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of individuals that may already possess negative perceptions and inclinations to poach. So this is going to lead to increased rates of both legal, due to more conflicts, and illegal killing. Now, in addition to this, there's no method of indiscriminate killing of wolves, like public hunting, trapping, hounding, killing of wolf pups in their dens, that has been proven effective at reducing wolf-human conflicts. There's simply no evidence there. And in fact, there's a recent academic article that is currently in review by Adrian Trevis, Jeremy Broscotter, and Mark Elbrock that provides further evidences, further references debunking all these claims. And I believe that the preprint is available to the public as well, if you're interested. So all this evidence against wolf killing, reducing harms to all beings, points to misguided, ill-founded policies that instead seem to harm our entire community of people, animals, and nature in multiple ways. So, in stark contrast to all these lethal methods, we find that there's a lot of evidence on non-lethal methods that effectively mitigate conflicts, that have been scientifically proven as effective in preventing these conflicts. These include flattery, an array of visual and sound deterrents, husbandry changes, and human presence, for example, and guardian animals such as livestock guardian dogs. Although, I'll note that the use of guardian animals is not without its problems for their protection and their care and treatment. So the question then becomes, right? If wolf killing causes such harms to our entire community of life and doesn't serve a conservation purpose, why is it still promoted in policy? For us, for me and my co-authors of these essays, and I'm sure for many of you, this is not just a scientific failure that we're dealing with here. Underlying these claims of these groups is an institutionalized, dominating view of wolves as a natural resource to be exploited given any human claim, as long as there is some lip service paid to it being done sustainably. Now, it is through this underlying view and examining it that we can examine all these claims, including the fifth one that I didn't touch on, which is killing for recreation. So that's why we need basically an ethical dialogue. Now, we need an ethical dialogue in part because the ethics underlying not only our relationship with wolves, but with all non-humans, gives little to no consideration to the harms caused to non-humans. And contrary to some indigenous perspectives, for example, Euro-North American federal and state agencies don't engage in a scientific and ethical exploration of who wolves are and how that should inform our relationships with them, despite us having overwhelming evidence of wolf sentience, of wolf self-awareness, even culture, among a bunch of other morally relevant traits. So let's touch briefly on what Western science reveals here about wolves and who wolves are. So Western science reveals wolves as feeling, thinking, complex individuals that have rich social lives, just like us in many ways, that want to know about their world and that value their lives as well as the lives of the individuals that they share their lives with. So by study and observation, we also know that each wolf has personalities that determine the history of their pack, because each wolf plays a critical role in pack structure. And that emotional bonding that happens there allows for the social cooperation that's necessary for successful breeding, successful rearing of pups, hunting, territory defense, which helps regulate, again, their populations. Now, to go even further, there's also wide acknowledgement that human and non-human animals share the same chemical, the same biological, anatomical to some extent, and cognitive structures even, that allow for the sharing of very similar basic emotions and interests with many animals. Now, for folks like, for example, philosopher Mary Mitchley and among many others, all of these qualities, right? Social, not only ecological, relationships are fundamental for ethical consideration because they highlight how the experiences of other beings can be sufficiently like our own for us to empathize, which is widely considered to be the first step towards moral consideration. So wolves have made unquantifiable contributions to our social lives as well, and the environment through just their agency, through just being themselves. Now, you're not going to find any of the scientific evidence on any Euro-North American management plan. Instead, the focus of management plans is usually on very particular, narrow scientific questions, namely, for example, how wolves may impact the interests of some humans, or the interests of some humans in controlling and exploiting wolves. I'll give you an example. A question that has been explored at length in the scientific literature is how much lethal management would wolf populations be able to support sustainably? Or another example, what does a, in great part largely uneducated public, both urban and rural, want from wolves? Whether it is to hear them or to be left alone, and how to achieve that for humans. Those questions never give a thought to wolves and wolf claims. Instead, wildlife management simply assumes that any human claim to eliminate any nuisance or to eliminate any risk or to recreation trumps the urgent claims of wild animals, for example, to life, to well-being, to social stability, or to health, which means wolves are treated as a combination of a natural resource, an object basically to use as humans see fit, and a nuisance to eliminate, right? And that exposes not only, again, untrustworthy scientific expertise at play within our public agencies, but also very narrow, inaccurate, inconsistent views that hold an inordinate amount of power over our relationship with wildlife. Now, a point I want to make here is that science may provide valuable information, but it doesn't tell you what you should do. That corresponds to ethics, and through ethics to policy and politics. On this point, again, there's plenty of evidence that identity, that values, that ethics drive not only policy, but science itself. Because worldviews, identity, your values determine the questions you ask and even how you go about answering those questions. So those scientific questions that focus largely on human benefits do so because they are grounded in worldviews that dismiss wolves in the way we mentioned. And it is because of this foundational role of ethics and worldviews that we are arguing we need ethics and worldviews need to be not only an explicit, but the central discourse within environmental and wildlife policy. Now, I'll note that, and I think it's important to note that while our ethical stance is pluralistic in welcoming ethical insights from diverse worldviews, and we'll go into that a little bit further on, that doesn't mean that we are relativistic. It doesn't mean that all ethical views are of equal value or equally legitimate. And I would say that as with science itself, reason, evidence, experience also helps us distinguish better from worse ethical viewpoints. So by dismissing a genuine ethical conversation about wolf protection, we are implicitly sanctioning and perpetuating those views which are already institutionalized. So let's now take a look at those worldviews. Already went through that. Now, let's see. So traditional conservation and wildlife management worldviews, and that's the issue that I'm going to be pointing to here, value and consider only those who possess an enshrined quality, like being human as opposed to non-human. And in that process, there's a lot of devaluing that happens. So there's a devaluing of others that don't share in those qualities, as well as a devaluing of what is fundamentally shared, including what is different and what is valuable about those others that we are devaluing. And that basically has been the case with traditional conservation since the late 19th century, when Gifford Pinchot, pictured there, and Theodore Roosevelt's wise use of natural resources paradigm co-opted US public opinion on conservation. And these are the values that were institutionalized in US government agencies. For example, consider the objectives of the US Fish and Wildlife Service that I added there: to understand, appreciate, and wisely use fish and wildlife resources, and do so for the continuing benefit of the American people. Now, under this paradigm, all human uses are permissible if they are judged sustainable by science, including ethically indefensible acts like trophy hunting or wolf hunting. So while Gifford-Pinchot was successful in establishing the scientific basis, the initial scientific basis for resource management. He did so with an underlying anthropocentric utilitarian philosophy. So conservation that only values certain human claims and whose rhetoric explicitly rallied people against reverence for non-human life, which was being championed by John Muir at the time. So this is a worldview that prioritizes, and this is explicit in Gifford-Pinchot's promotion of it, that prioritizes an imperialist manifest destiny, that prioritizes mastery over nature, and that values ecological claims instrumentally. So the environment is important only to the extent that it affects human interest. That's the current paradigm of our public agencies, not only for wolves, but for all wildlife. Now, scholarly work has found this thinking not limited to the human-animal divide, but intimately tied to other worldviews that place a higher value on certain human qualities, such as whiteness or maleness or heteronormativity, ableness, rationality, carnism, you name it, among others like manifest destiny. Right? So others who don't share in those enshrined qualities have to some extent been dismissed from consideration, despite their claims, despite their contributions to society, and despite their disproportionate vulnerability given those same prejudices. And I'll note that it is no different with wolves. They value their lives and well-being, they contribute greatly to a healthy environment, and are extremely vulnerable to harm. So established wildlife management then and wildlife management worldviews are then linked to other prejudicial views acting within humans, like racism, like sexism, like homophobia, like ableism. So the rationale that sanctions these dominating views within wolf policy prejudices people against others who are different, both human and non-human. And consistent with these prejudices, there's a shocking lack of human diversity within wildlife management and policy, with the profession basically being composed of mostly older white males and similar resource boards with ties to hunters and ranchers. Now, I want to make a point here that I guess the point that I'm trying to make is not that worldviews dismissive of wolves are oppressive because they lead to other humans being oppressed. The point is that the same flawed logic that dismisses what is fundamental, valuable, and shared by wolves, humans, and a lot of other non-human beings in favor of an arbitrary quality like being human, white, male, or eating meat. Okay? So looking at it from that perspective of it being the same flawed logic for wolves as well as humans, this should be considered a social justice issue, especially for historically oppressed communities, because they have experienced the same logic, they've experienced the same dismissal and the same vulnerability. So last thing I'm going to say about social science research is that this research has also detailed how these dominating values of US public agencies towards non-human animals are increasingly at odds with those of their constituents, which are turning out to be far more considerate and compassionate towards animals. Now, what I want to do after this is explore a little bit, I should say, the traditional worldview of the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes towards wolves, which on our essays we endorse because it follows sound ethics and sound science from both an indigenous as well as better evidence Western worldviews. So what does the Ojibwe worldview consider wolves as? The Ojibwe consider wolves as non-human persons, and not only persons, but relatives, which is important because this implies a social, again, rather than an ecological bond. So wolves for the Ojibwe as persons, as relatives, are worthy of compassion and justice. And in fact, in their wolf policy documents, like this relationship plan of the Bat River tribe, They foreground who wolves are. They acknowledge wolf contributions, and they aim to achieve reciprocal, respectful relationships with wolves. Now, in policy, the Ojibwe translate this to opposing wolf hunting, to opposing population caps, and opposing lethal management and conflict resolution, and instead support protection for wolves from harm, barring self-defense. Now, importantly, they have these worldviews and they acknowledge these policies without the necessity of much of Western science and what Western science has focused on. And this view of wolves as relatives, as worthy of care and respect, is a view that is also shared by hundreds of indigenous tribes globally. Now, Western scholarship suggests that the Ojibwe traditional view is far more holistic than those applied in wolf management as well. And it's more grounded on contemporary ethics, philosophy, and science. So, and I'm gonna give you two statements by Western academics that we added to our essays as an example. And the first one comes from philosopher of science and ethics, Mary Mitchley. And I'm gonna read this statement real quick. She says in her book, Beast and Man, which was first published in 1976, she states, recently ethologists have taken the trouble to watch wolves systematically between mealtimes and have found them to be by human standards, paragons of steadiness and good conduct. They pair for life, they are faithful and affectionate spouses and parents, they show great loyalty to their pack and great courage and persistence in the face of difficulties. They carefully respect one another's territories, keep their dens clean, and extremely seldom kill anything that they do not need for dinner. If they fight with another wolf, the encounter normally ends with a submission. They have an inhibition about killing the suppliant and about attacking females and cubs. They have also, like all social animals, a fairly elaborate etiquette, including subtly varied ceremonies of greeting and reassurance by which friendships are strengthened, cooperation achieved, and the wheels of social life generally oiled. Our knowledge of this behavior is not based upon the romantic impressions of casual travelers. It rests on long and careful investigations by trained zoologists, backed up by miles of film, graphs, maps, population surveys, droppings analysis, and all the rest of the contemporary tool bag. So that, more than any other statement that you'll find on a Western wildlife management plan, gives you a far more accurate perception of wolves. But I'm gonna add to that statement by wolf biologist Gordon C. Haber, who studied wolves in Denali National Park for decades. And he states, high intelligence, expressiveness, and unusual emotional depth enable wolves to maintain sophisticated social bonds, to work together as highly skilled cooperative hunters. This same extraordinary sentience that is so integral to their basic biology also provides an ethical reason for not allowing them to be harvested and for considering remedial short-term control only in the rarest of circumstances, when there are solid, irrefutable biological and cost-benefit arguments and no other reasonable alternatives. To treat them otherwise is wrong. And that is poignant from a scientist to state to get into the ethics of an individual, but in fact, he did so because a lot of his research was exploring the social life of these individuals. So he got to know his subjects intimately. Now I want to focus on what these worldviews, both indigenous, Ojibwa, and Western, share and value. Both of them promote the consideration of others who may be different in some ways, but who nevertheless share in the fundamental experiences of desiring autonomy over their lives, of being vulnerable, of depending on others for their physical, social, and psychological well-being, of being mortal as well. We are also all members of a multi-species community. And here I want to point to go back and note that another convergence here is on Mary Midgley's concept of mixed communities, which reminds us, like many indigenous worldviews, that a purely human community is a terrible fiction invented by anthropocentric thought. On the contrary, humans have always lived within a mixed community of species, and animals have allowed us to achieve our current state of well-being, our current state of development, and contribute to the health of the environment we depend on. They have their own lives and claims and our relationships, as any relationship in a community should be based on reciprocity. So what do we have with these views? We have some acknowledgement that humans are not of more value than non-humans, that humans have no right to decide over the lives of other animals, and that instead we should be promoting reciprocal arrangements. Now, under these worldviews, doing right by wolves, indigenous peoples, domesticated animals, and their humans, and the broad public would mean, first, protecting wolves from lethal management and harm, especially from recreational killing, but also in conflict management. And two, a focus on proven non-lethal methods to resolve conflicts, barring clear immediate threats to life, which is already allowed under full protections. Now, how do we move from the current state, current worldviews, towards worldviews more leading to coexistence with wildlife? The first point to make here is that, of course, wolves are only one of many beings being affected by this dismissal of science and ethical deliberation. This is, again, institutionalized within broader wildlife management. For example, we see it in state wildlife killing contests, in Bureau of Land Management roundups of wild mustangs out west, among a host of other controversies. So how then should we begin to move towards coexistence, which entails a caring and respectful relationship? So we argue that for that to begin, we need to democratize wildlife policy through the equitable participation of currently underrepresented worldviews at all policy levels. As evidence here, from the multiple lawsuits by Native American tribes and wildlife advocacy organizations to the thousands of comments received against reducing protections for wolves, and even what the social science says, it's clear that the public wants at least some increased consideration for animals in nature, but again, being shut out from within. Now, of course, a blatant example of this is how the Trump administration's delisting proposals did not include consultation with Native American tribes in clear violation of the law, and then the Biden administration has simply followed their lead. So that's huge importance there of committing to establishing equitable participation for worldviews. Now, in addition to that, we also need to promote ethical deliberation and analyze how values translate to policy. And we suggest that for this, agencies focus on creating official spaces for ethical deliberation and analysis. Why? Because we need to establish an ethical analysis within the policy process that helps us clarify what values and attitudes towards wildlife, towards others in general, towards our community, our policies promote, and why. Of course, this ethical deliberation is going to demand better ethical education and training for decision makers, for managers, for technicians, in all branches of government. But these initiatives would open spaces for a productive exchange of worldviews, a clarification of values. It would open space for mutual understanding. And through that, it could rebuild this ethics-science relationships that really allows us to triangulate on the best policies that further everyone's well-being. And we know that there's precedence for this type of institutionalized ethics-based policy dialogue as well. There's precedence on this through, for example, the Barred Owl stakeholder group that was sort of this idea explored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with help from ethicists like William Lynn. These are initiatives that would certainly promote the National Environmental Policy Act's goals of improving decision-making and facilitating broad public participation. And this process could also be supplemented by ethics briefs or reviews created with the assistance of trained experts. Now, as important as those changes are, it is, we posit, equally important to promote an ethic of care and justice towards non-humans of nature front and center. And to begin heading in that direction, there's a stark need to explore who other animals are again, what they want, our responsibilities towards them, reciprocal relationships. No, we need to understand that wolves, as many other animals, again, value their lives. They feel and seek to avoid harm. They are self-aware and hold complex social bonds. All of these are empirical facts that carry serious ethical implications. Now, I mentioned that we should foreground ethics and ethics of care and justice. And these are two very important concepts that I want to touch on. Why? Because caring, for example, is critical because it focuses on the most vulnerable, on alleviating suffering and strengthening those personal and social bonds. And respecting justice are also intimately tied. And these words get thrown around a lot without folks perhaps knowing what they mean. So I'll just share how I've come to understand them. And I've come to understand respecting someone as that meaning appropriate or due consideration of the claims of that other. And justice is tied to establishing reciprocal, fair arrangements based on that respect for that other, so that you don't find respect without justice and justice without respect. So if we respect animals as individuals, that argues for justice. In other words, right? The equitable consideration of their claims alongside humans rather than their exploitation for our convenience or our pleasure. That seems to us the strongest ethical position. Now, as template for that, the US could protect wolves permanently through species-specific legislation at the federal or state level. At the federal level, we have precedent for that through the Bald Eagle Protection Act. And we also have new proposals for wolves specifically, like those promoted by many indigenous tribes through their drafted wolf treaty. But there seems to be plenty of ethical education necessary for us to get there. So in closing, wrapping up, right, coming back to wolves, again, they value their own lives and have much more urgent claims for protection, urgent claims to life, to freedom from harm that humans have for killing them, be it recreation, nuisance, hatred, or bias. Yet governments are choosing policies that devalue wolves and otherness in general, rather than choosing to promote their consideration, a care, and respect that attends to what we both share and to relevant differences. That is an ethical and social justice issue, again, not a scientific matter, and we should treat it as such. And in the process, I'll close with Mary Mitchley, as she states, right, we should always remember that our social nature and our empathy are not restricted to who is like us, be it in skin color, in ability, in sex, gender, species, you name it. Instead, our communities, our wonder, our care, our respect have never been limited to humans. And it is not in no small part because of wolves. So that simple, intuitive recognition can be extremely powerful when employed politically, because to protect wolves, and by protecting wolves, we protect our entire mixed community of life. And I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Wow, Fran, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and take some time for questions now. But first, for those of you who joined after the introduction, we are here with Francisco Santiago-Ávila, who just finished his presentation about the need for ethically based scientific oversight of wolf populations. Again, if you do want to ask a question, just go into the Q&A box at the bottom of your computer, and you could type it in there. The first question, our society puts so much value on dogs and the human-dog relationship. How do anti-wolf groups reconcile a negative view of wolves with our cultural bonds to dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm somewhat familiar with the literature exploring this, but please don't take my answers as, this is how it is. I think there's an issue there of needing to control these individuals and having to have certain control over their lives and regulating them strongly. That happens with dogs, of course, because to some extent we need to restrict their activities because of the environment that they move around in and the consequences of them being unrestricted in that environment. That is not the case with wolves. And there seems to be an element there, right? And as I mentioned, I think the idea of having a self-proclaimed right to decide over animal lives is far more pervasive than any other. And that's what it comes down to with this difference between these differences between how we treat wolves and how we treat dogs, is this idea that dogs may be fine because we have a certain control over them, and that control sort of gives us a sense of security for them being around. But it's also this idea that perhaps it might be that the misperception that wolves and dogs are so different because we've affected them in ways that no longer we've affected them in ways that took them away from that wildness that we fear and that lack of control. So again, I think the idea of mastery over nature and needing to have that by these individuals is a critical component of their worldviews and of traditional conservation in general.
That makes sense. Here's another question. What are some simple word changes that can be used in state policy to create more ethical dialogue? I guess our choice of language.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that could be done there. First of all, the wildlife management plans, because the focus has been on and the rhetoric, the discourse around wildlife management has been science-based. They tend to have very scientific language that depersonalizes, almost objectifies to an extent these beings, because it doesn't reveal who they really are as individuals. And I think that's part of the conversation that needs to be had. So not calling them organisms, not referring only to the population of these individuals. And this is something that you even see with scientists that call themselves wolf advocates, and that potentially want sustainable wolf populations. But when you ask them, they may not be contrary or opposed to lethal management because wolves in general are resilient. And what they mean is wolf can handle this amount of killing. So it's a weird faith. It's a weird faith to have in wolves that they'll bounce back because we keep killing them. So there's a lot that can be started by looking at these individuals as persons, as relatives. And I pointed to the Bad River relationship plan between the Ojibwa and Maingan, their term for wolf, because you don't see that type of language there. You see personhood, you see family, you see relatives, you see reciprocity, you see mutual flourishing. And those are the kinds of things that we really need. Now, this comes also alongside an issue within science, which is science is focusing mostly on cost and benefits in relation to wolves. And what we can gather from wolf management is generally focused on cost and benefits for humans. And I would argue that a big difference between Western management, wildlife management, and indigenous worldviews is that Western wildlife management focuses on costs and benefits, while indigenous worldviews and more holistic Western worldviews focus on a language of part and whole, of being part of a larger community of life, rather than what am I going to get from managing this animal in a certain way.
Next question is, do you think the animal activist community is ahead of the conservation community in talking about harm to animals and looking at wolves as individuals?
Yes. I think so. I think, there's I when I got in conservation into conservation for my PhD, I was surprised because my first when I decided to research wolves, my first instinct was to see what animals, what beings am I dealing with here? What are their lives like? What are their capabilities, etc. So it doesn't it it doesn't come across that much with unfortunately in wildlife management that folks are interested in the individuals. It's mostly an issue of population, an issue of biodiversity, an issue of sustainability, and there's a lot of conversations happening around this within conservation. There are other paradigms that are coming out of conservation that are more respectful, that are based sometimes on personhood, some of them. So, coming back to it, yeah, the animal philosophy, animal ethics literature, nature ethics, ecofeminist literature, they're all way ahead of the game and way ahead of a lot of traditional conservation and folks who hold those values in general.
Agreed. And I mean, how do you think in like grassroots efforts to really start changing minds or changing the paradigm? Like, what do you think about that? How do you think that can happen?
Yeah, well, a big message that I've just tried to communicate is that I don't know how far we can get with this idea and this rhetoric, this whole discourse of best available science for wolves, because that doesn't speak to the worldviews that are already embedded, institutionalized in our agencies. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not going to restrict folks from hunting if their mission is to wisely use those resources for the benefit of the American people. And some people think they will benefit from hunting wolves because they get whatever utility they get from it. So there needs to be a reckoning that the whole worldview that on which our relationship with wildlife was founded on and that was institutionalized by folks in the beginning of last century doesn't work anymore. Like it doesn't work for a lot of agencies and a lot of social issues that we're dealing with here. In human relationships, it's just not the worldview that the public is behind anymore. And I'll go back to Aldo Leopold as well and state that his big message, and he was an ecologist, a scientist, founder of wildlife management. But his main message on the Sand County Almanac was you need to change the content of the education. You don't need more science. You just need to change the content of the education so that individuals consider themselves only a citizen of the land community, another citizen of the land community. Again, a lot of convergence with these Western views that I spoke to, a lot of convergence with indigenous views that just gets dismissed. And Aldo Leopold is mentioned a lot by wildlife managers, but not so much in that sense, not so much that interpretation. And that's a bias there as well.
Yeah, a lot of the questions here are, and I see the chat's going crazy the whole time, but about the importance of education and having to start really early to get this conversation started with children.
Right.
This is a little bit trickier, just in terms of how to handle invasive species and still be fair, I guess. I'm trying to, it's a long question, but how do we handle that if it requires doing harm to one species to maybe help another one or prevent that one from going extinct?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, unfortunately, there's so many points that to address in that question that I doubt that I'm not going to be able to do it justice. Some guidelines there, right, that sort of track with what I've just mentioned is, this idea that we have the right to decide. We somehow, sort of attributed ourselves the right to decide what was bad for the environment, what we wanted the environment to look like, and what we wanted to do to make that environment look like that in terms of composition of species, etc. Now, this is not to say that there are some, moving species that may actually cause more harm than good and may need some type of management. But this assumption right from the start that, species that are newcomers are bad because they are having a certain impact on the environment, we need to realize that those impacts that we see as negatives are also based on our interest, right? So to the extent that we decenter, or remove ourselves from the center of our decisions and see ourselves again as one of many individuals with claims here, we may see that, invasive species, and in fact, science says that most invasive species, are not harmful and don't require any management. And yet we decide to do so because, sometimes perceptions that the environment should be a certain way. So I would go back to assessing, why do we think that we have the right to intervene in their lives? Why are we doing this? And are we triaging this to the extent that if we believe that this is ethical, are we looking for the least harmful solutions? And that all of those, I would think that they are hardly ever the case that all of those track with wildlife management, unfortunately.
It's true. And you've talked about like different tribes. Are there any countries that are just a little further along in this type of thinking?
Yeah, good question. I just, probably a lot of you saw that Ecuador's highest court, Ecuador Supreme Court, recently interpreted their rights of nature statute in their constitution to include not only ecological wholes, ecological aggregates like species, like national parks, like mountains and rivers, but also individuals, and the Supreme Court sort of is stating that individual animals have a right to be free, have a right to freedom from harm, to enjoy their lives, etc. That, the fact that it's in their constitution, the fact that on top of being in their constitution, folks probably being a rights of nature argument maybe thought that that would be useful for ecosystems, but it wouldn't really touch individual animals. And again, Ecuador being at the forefront of how you should interpret these statutes in a holistic, inclusive way, that there is no need to exclude individuals that have these claims and make these contributions. And that, I believe, is light years ahead of what we're doing here in the States and probably what most countries are doing around the world.
That's news to me. That is really, that's great. Thank you. Someone's asking, who's your role model growing up? Do you have any heroes?
Role model growing up, I would say my mom was my role model growing up. She, I came to conservation through concerns about social justice. Maggie mentioned that I did political science and economics and did public policy. So initially I wasn't, animals weren't on my radar. I got into ecology through environmental economics, environmental economic valuation. So what has really been driving me this whole time, and this is why my mother is a role model, is because she instilled in me values of social justice, of caring for the most vulnerable. And I've never been able to let that go. And that has been the major driver. And when I found out that animals were being so dismissed in conservation, I just couldn't let it go. And that's why I'm here now.
That's amazing. I'm not sure if this is a serious question, but someone wants to know if you're single.
I'm not single. I'm happily married. And
okay, whoever that is out there, sorry. But here's another question. Someone's asking what PanWorks is.
PanWorks is a new think tank, US-based think tank that's dedicated to furthering the well-being of animals through compassion and respect in a holistic way that takes into account people, animals, and nature. And that's where PAN of PanWorks comes from. And it was founded, our executive director and founder is William Lin, who's an ethicist at Clark University. And thank you for that. I forgot my acknowledgements here for my co-authors. And those are basically Liv Baker, Kristen Stewart, and William Lin. And I, under the leadership of Bill, founded this think tank last year because based on this perception that so much of our issues with wildlife don't come down to best available science at all. They're a matter of worldviews, and we need to move that conversation and that discourse forward.
That's great. And there's lots of more other questions, but they're kind of similar. And I was wondering if there's anything else you want to share with us before we wrap things up.
Before we wrap things up, yeah, if I would take away anything from this is that in so many ways, it's all the same fight against forms of discrimination that dismiss otherness, dismiss differences, and dismiss fundamental similarities, that we are all mortal in some way, that we are all extremely vulnerable to harm, and that we should cherish each other and reciprocate and establish reciprocal relationships that really further the flourishing of our entire community. And that's not going to happen without decentering human interest and questioning and potentially, taking a active stance against this idea that we can just intervene in animals' lives because we want to or we have a particular interest without any consideration for them. We are not more valuable. This is something that even, scientists like Darwin have said, our differences are of degree, not in kind. So plenty of scientific evidence on this, plenty of ethical evidence. None of it seems to get to wildlife management. And that, again, is a social justice issue, is an ethical issue.
Well said. Something I'm going to take away is for all the parents out there. Remember who his hero is, right, Fran? It was mom. So get to it, moms and dads.
Most of the time it's mom.
All right, moms. Fran, I can't tell you how many comments here are just so thankful for your presentation tonight and the answers to these questions. So, we're getting somewhere, at least. There are people here that are saying amen. So this is a good start. But again, I just want to thank everybody. And if you want to go to PanWorks, you can find, there's a website there where you can read Fran's most recent essays. What's the website?
Yeah, the website is panworks.io.
Great. And also Project Coyote and Rewilding Institute, two great organizations. Probably stick an org on the end of those titles and you'll find those websites as well. So Fran, thanks again. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We will have a recording of this up on our website soon. So don't worry if you missed some of it or if you want to review it. In the meantime, if you do have any questions or want to learn more about the Wolf Conservation Center, you can visit our website, and that's at www.nywolf.org, where you can watch some wolves, learn about the 33 wolves or 32 wolves they call the Wolf Center home, and hopefully you'll join us for our next webinar. So thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Fran. Bye-bye.
Yeah.